Okay, so I think we should start. It may be that one or two more people will join us, but I'd like to give a warm welcome to everybody for this first virtual version of the annual Schröder lecture event, which is hosted by the German and Dutch section of the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics at Cambridge. I'm Andrew Webber, I'm the current director of the section. Of course, we would usually congregate in person. We'd enjoy a reception and a candlelit dinner for our speaker, for our special guests and colleagues and students in the section. But I trust that the event in this other form will also prove memorable and that we can introduce our speaker to the theatre of a Cambridge College dinner on another occasion. Now, before I introduce our speaker, a word about some special guests this evening. First and foremost, this is an opportunity for us to thank representatives of the Schröder and Mallinckrodt families and of the Schröder Foundation, which has not only generously re-endowed the Schröder Chair of German, but through the Schröder Fund, also enables so much of our activity at every level. We're immensely grateful for all that you've done for us. I'd also like to give a particular welcome to other valued friends and supporters who are with us today. Peter Barnes and Antonio Wunderlich from the British German Association, and Paul Stocker, who heads its schools charity Youthbridge, John Bald from the British Association of Teachers of German, and our alumni and supporters, James Marsh and Peter Lawrence. And this leads me to our principal guest. It's a great pleasure to welcome Thomas Ostermeier, who joins us hotfoot from Berlin, from rehearsals in Berlin. To use a nice German artisan term, he's a preeminent contemporary Theatermacher, a maker of theatre. He studied directing at the Hochschule für Schauspielkunst Ernst Busch in Berlin, before becoming assistant director to his mentor, Manfred Kage. In 1996, he was made artistic director for the Baracke at the Deutsches Theater, where in collaboration with dramaturg Jens Hilje and designer Stefan Schmidtke, he created a program of productions addressing contemporary realities. He sought to move German theatre away from a culture of ornament and star-led spectacle towards a more stripped down and honest engagement with the sort of psychological and social realism that was pioneered by young British playwrights like Sarah Kane and Mark Ravenhill, whom he introduced to the German stage. He also deployed this aesthetic for classic dramatic texts, not least in his strategic reworkings of Ibsen and Shakespeare. In 1999, Thomas Ostermeier became resident director at Berlin's Schaubühne, which has become his house, as German would have it. He's also taken his productions around the globe to great acclaim, not least with highly successful productions here in the UK. He's garnered many national and international awards for his work, including a Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale in 2011. So there's Thomas Ostermeier in a nutshell, and we're delighted to welcome you this evening as our speaker. Before we start with the event proper, just a few words about the program. There'll first be a three-way conversation, which will be led by my colleague Annja Neumann, whose initiative it was to invite Thomas Ostermeier to speak to us. So a brief word of introduction for Annja as well. She joined the section as research associate for the Schnitzler Digital Edition project, leading on an edition of Schnitzler's Marionetten cycle, and in a post which was supported in the final year by the Schröder Fund. She's currently postdoctoral fellow at Cambridge Digital Humanities, working at the intersection of digital culture, medical humanities, literary narrative, and dramaturgy. Now, our conversation will touch on some key themes, and it'll be interspersed with two short videos presenting different aspects of Thomas Ostermeier's work. And the final part of the event will then be an open floor Q&A. We'd like to encourage anybody who would like to pose a question at that point to indicate this using the chat function. And we'll call upon as many of you as we can to put your questions directly to Thomas Ostermeier. Okay, so without more ado, we'll see the first short video as a way into the conversation.
Wir sind ein Berliner Theater und ich bin ein Berliner Theatermacher und ich mache Theater für diese Stadt. Ich glaube auch, dass viele internationale Festivals uns einladen, weil sie sich einen Teil von Berlin einladen wollen. Weil diesen Mythos, den Berlin heutzutage besitzt, diesen Nimbus, den es weltweit besitzt, den laden sie sich mit diesen Aufführungen mit ein.
Also heute fand ich, hat es mir ganz gut gefallen, oder ich habe mich sehr gut darüber gefreut, dass die Leute miteinander auf einmal dann auch geredet haben. Und dass wir dann irgendwie auch ein bisschen unwichtig wurden. Das ist super. Wenn man diese Diskussion aufmacht, dann ist sie so, wie sie ist, und das ist dann völlig egal, so wie sie läuft, sozusagen. Manchmal freut man sich dann auch daran, dass die Leute so teilnehmen, und manchmal ist es auch eine Erkenntnis, wenn nicht.
Wir bitten mal jeden, der Ihrer Meinung ist, einfach die Hand zu heben.
In der Form der Reaktion gibt es Unterschiede, aber das Gefühl, dass überall auf der Welt, wo man hinkommt im Moment, die Leute zweifeln an der Veränderbarkeit von Wirklichkeit durch Politik und zweifeln an der Möglichkeit, dass die einzelnen Gesellschaften überleben können, in dieser politischen Form überleben können. Das ist sowas, was alle Orte bisher geeint hat.
So again, I'd like to welcome Thomas Ostermeier at this point in this very curious space, really, which is intersecting with a lot of living rooms and offices and studies in Cambridge, across Britain. I'm sitting on the other side of England, really, in the west, close to Wales, and then across the Channel up to Berlin, and really around the world, as far as I can see, where our attendants and participants are coming from. And Thomas Ostermeier, in the short clip which we just saw and watched, you mentioned the myth-making around Berlin as a place with its own atmosphere and fascination and fame, particularly with regard to the performing and visual arts. And among the colleagues and friends to whom I spoke in the run-up of the event, your name also evoked myth-making and catchphrases like Deutsches Regietheater, the German director's theater, and post-traumatic theater came up. And I suspect that this kind of myth-making acquires additional significance, really, as we cross national borders and engage with theater practices in different cultural contexts. And for me, it's quite telling that German director's theater and post-traumatic theater are aesthetic paradigms that are not part largely of your own practice, and you have explicitly positioned yourself against these trends. And I thought, as a kind of prologue and by way of context for our participants, we might begin by discussing the core values that define your work against that context. And I'd like to link this to a site-specific question and to your special relationship to British theatre. Andrew Webber already mentioned Sarah Kane as one of the writers whose plays you have staged. And as many participants are located in Britain this evening, and more specifically in Cambridge, with quite a few students in the room who engage with performance cultures, both in Germany and Britain, I thought your special relationship with Anglo-American playwrights, and so there's Sarah Kane's play Blasted, for instance, which you staged in 2005, Mark Ravenhill's Shopping and Fucking might be mentioned in this context as well, that these would be a good point of departure, your special relationship to British theatre, not least because it's often cited as a basis for your international success. And as we can now see here on the screen, and I brought a provocative prompt as for my first question here, and as a testament of this special relationship to English playwrights, I brought this newspaper clipping from the Financial Times, published on the 1st of January 2000, which marks your arrival to the Schaubühne. It was part of an interview with James Woodall. And the title Wood Communicator, more than anything else, refers perhaps to the unfamiliar tone for a British audience and the existential approach of your early productions. And so, keeping this in mind, I start with a biographical question. And this evening, I wondered, what was it that drew you to theatre in the first place? What drives your fascination for it, and what keeps you interested and made you engage with British theatre? Long introduction, but there we are.
Wow. Yeah, thanks for having me. Welcome to everybody. I'm absolutely delighted that there's such a big interest in my work, and I'm also delighted to see that James Woodall is with us, who wrote this article, which you just put on screen. So what is my connection to British theatre? Why did I start making theatre? I think there is a very biographical moment in my life when I moved at the age of 8 years from the north of Germany to the south of Germany, because my father was in the army, and he wanted to move back. He comes from the south, from Bavaria, and I was confronted with a completely different dialect, and I was even kind of outsider, because I was speaking Hochdeutsch, which would be literally translated as High German, which means no dialect. And in the area where I found myself, this was regarded as a quite arrogant way of talking, and pretending to be somebody who claims to be better than the rest. So I had this outsider situation being confronted to, and I was looking for ways to escape this. And one way was music, and the other way was theater, because in theater and on stage, so I went on stage already at the age of 12 as an actor. That was an advantage to speak this kind of German. And it was for me also a space of freedom and free expression, and a moment where I could express myself in the way I wanted to. that was also true for music, and still today I feel a little bit sad that I made my career in theater and not in music. Still today, I have a great passion for music, and all of my plays in one way or another are dealing with music. You already did in the introduction some stations of my career, but one moment was for sure when I took over the artistic direction. An important moment was for sure that I all of a sudden was confronted to a lot of new plays which were introduced to me by the dramaturg of the Deutsches Theater, Michael Ebert, at that time. And he introduced this English playwrights, Scottish playwrights, Irish playwrights, American playwrights, who which were not that known, and some of them were not even put on stage in Germany. All this was thanks to a relationship the Deutsches Theater at that time had with the Royal Court Theatre and Graham Wybrow, who was a literary manager of the Royal Court at that time. And so what happened after having been into a theater school in East Berlin, or former East Berlin, where I mostly was confronted with classical plays, Brecht, and some plays of the early 20th century, I found these plays, and I still remember when I read Sarah Kane's Bastard for the first time. For me, it had a massive impact on me, because I couldn't stop reading it. I immediately had to read it in one go through till the very end, and all of a sudden I understood that there is playwriting, contemporary playwriting, which actually talks about our times. So what usually was German theater to take classics and adapt them to nowadays times, this transformation wasn't necessary. So you could talk about what parts of the world outside the theater without this transformation. And so I had a tool with these plays to directly communicate what I wanted to say, or parts of how these writers portrayed our society. And also, I mean, for example, Shopping and Fucking by Mark Ravenhill was talking about the effects which Thatcherism had on British society in the late 80s and the early 90s. And I think these effects we were dealing with a bit later than the British society. So when this play came to us, it was even a little bit prophetic in a way, because then the neoliberal laws were not at the very degree installed in Germany. So I was talking about class issues, I was talking about poverty, I was talking about how difficult it was for young people to make a living in a big city like London or Berlin at that time. So it became a kind of theater which is very much familiar to the British people or Americans, English-speaking countries, where you have this tradition of working very intimate with directors, with writers, and putting up a new play every time you put on a new show, which is not at all the tradition in Germany, but our work at the Baracke changed a little bit this situation in Germany, and I do believe that this was a promotion for contemporary playwrights, and also created a new generation of German
playwrights, amongst Marius von Meyenburg, Roland Schimmelpfennig, Falk Richter. So all of a sudden, German theater understood or learned a lot by this British tradition of playwrights theater. And that's true for the 20th century anyway, because there was another moment when John Osborne for the first time was brought to Germany, or later in the late 70s, Edward Bond. Peter Stein, interestingly, made his first step in the career was saved by Edward Bond. So there seems to be a kind of tradition that German theater always gets a very important impulse from the British islands. Not talking about Shakespeare, who was so important for the German classics. And one reason for why I never put on a German classic is that most of the German classical plays try to imitate or copy even Shakespeare, so I always prefer to do the original. That's why I'm doing Shakespeare, not Goethe or Schiller. So to give a long answer to a short question.
Well, I think that's fascinating, especially when you said that in a way what was happening in British theatre at the time was anticipating a development which would only happen later, thinking about neoliberalism in Germany. So yes, and also I think we will talk about language a bit further down the line. And I read the article James Woodall wrote in this interview, and he quoted you saying that you would want theater evenings or productions or theater to be like rock concerts. and yeah, perhaps that's also something to come back to later, especially when we think about German bourgeois theater, which is always related to quite an elitist endeavor. But perhaps first of all, I'm still with our location today, this evening, and it was really good to get the sense about British theater and in relationship to German theater. But I'd like to move in closer now to our immediate environment and to zoom in a way. And this evening we are inhabiting a virtual environment or a virtual stage, as it were, and video conferencing platforms such as Zoom equalize people's physical dimensions. And judging from pictures, you're quite tall in real life, but we all just get our cages and our boxes. And so at the moment, we have a lot of bodies stuck in small spaces and isolated. And on Zoom, we are reduced to rectangles and flattened. And we have become, in a way, projected images turned into two dimensions. Whether we are tall or small, Zoom is a leveler. And theater now has survived for thousands of years because of its three-dimensionality and liveness. And while theater as we know it is not happening in Germany or in Britain at the moment, I've noticed that you have been active in online events all over the world. And there seems to be a more global trend of talking about theater, watching past productions online, and indeed of debates that challenge established theatrical forms. And so I wondered, what are your thoughts about cinema, TV, Zoom, or other virtual platforms where an increasing number of people are glued to two dimensions? We can perhaps talk about the COVID situation later, but even setting that aside, what do you think about theater making practices for the future? Do you think, has our relationship to theater changed during your career, even if you just take the first steps of your career as you were sketching it out earlier to today? I wonder, talking about the relationship to British theater, but now more closely, has it changed, especially when we're thinking about this analog media or two-dimensional way of engaging with culture?
Well, my theory on the success of Schaubühne theater was always linked to the fact that we became a digitalized world, and that younger generations and the others also are very much used to get a view of the world via a flat screen, if it was television or movies or a computer. And I think that especially the digital natives, or a lot of them, are discovering theater, or have been discovering theater as something very fascinating, because all of a sudden you can decide yourself where to look on. It's not about the editing of the director or of the cutter in the cutting room later. They all of a sudden see something in front of their eyes which cannot be photoshopped, which cannot be faked by any means. What's happening in front of you when in a three-dimensional room an actor is performing is happening in this very moment. And I think thanks to digitalized world, there's a crave for these moments of truth or veracity, if this word exists in English. I think it's a French word. So I never had any fear that theater is not relevant anymore or is an dying art form. Not at all. I saw and I got the feedback from a lot of audience members that for them it's a very special moment to come to Schaubühne, and they feel more alive. They feel to be part of something which you cannot find at any other place in our mediatized world. When it comes, or when you ask about the development over the years, of course, this moment of the pandemic is a moment never been there before, at least in my life, which probably marks something very special, something cruel, especially for the people being infected, or people working in hospitals or old people's homes. So my thoughts in these moments are always with these people, and also linked to the fact that my brother is running a hospital, and so I'm constantly in contact with him. So this is where we need to focus at the moment. I truly believe that this should be our biggest concern, how to fight the pandemic. And then the second step might be, let's talk about theater and what's going on with theater in this very moment. But this step is after the first step. I don't have any fears for the future of theater. I think we will, if there is an end to this pandemic, theater will come back even stronger than before, and not this hybrid forms of theater, digitalized and real time, but the truthful live event theater. I'm pretty sure, I mean, there's some historical moments where this was proven after the Spanish flu in 1918 till 1920. After this, we had the Roaring 20s, and with an explosion of art on all levels. And I think this was also linked to the fact that people wanted to celebrate life again, and wanted to go out and wanted to be with other people. But also, what I was reading during the pandemic is the fact that during Shakespeare times, there was a Bourbonische pest, the bubonic plague, and the Elizabethan theaters were under lockdown. over and over again because of this. And it was probably most beautiful and most important time of European theater so far. So I'm not at all concerned about the future of theater.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that. You talk about two steps there, and I agree about the priority that it's fighting the pandemic. Yes, it's first of all a matter of medical doctors, but I do wonder whether those two things, there might be a connection there, and so I wondered whether it would also be a critical moment for theater, if we think of the pandemic as a catastrophic experience, and that there's also amount of social or societal trauma, and whether theater could do something to engage with that experience at a later stage.
Well, theater has always been talking about catastrophes and about moments of horror and moments of threat, and always confronted us with the reality of people fighting for power, with the reality of wars because of people or countries fighting each other. So I think I might even say theater is an expert, or theater writers have always been experts on what we are confronted with now. It's I mean, Jon Fosse put it, death and love, always the same subjects in theater. And I think this is true. I mean, we are dealing in a lot of our plays with death and mortality. And theater as an art form, maybe even the best art form to confront us with the fact that we are mortal, and with vanity, because after 1.5 hours or 2 hours or sometimes 5 hours, it's over and it will never come back. Sometimes I have this experience when I had a premiere. I feel like incredibly sad because the experience is over, and it is sometimes even like grief or mourning, because you cannot have this moment back, and it will never happen again. That this story will see an audience for the first time. So what I'm trying to say is, I don't think we necessarily have to reinvent completely, because we're anyway dealing with these issues in theater. And also something which has been told so many times before, since we are confronted with the pandemic. Pandemic is only accelerating what's anyway happening in our modern times, and in our form of capitalism. The richer become more rich, and the poorer become more poor, and the mortality amongst people who are in the working class is higher than people in the bourgeois class, and so on and so on. So these are anyway issues I'm trying to confront my audiences with. I'm always trying to talk about social realities, to talk about reality of class, the reality of class societies, where we have to deal with questions of gender, questions of race, and questions of class. And as I said, the pandemic is only accelerating these problems.
Yeah, so before I hand over to Andrew Weber, I just want to perhaps probe you. So don't you think that we are now these days talking more about theater? That a lot of more people started to consider what theater does and questioning what means might be appropriate and how that might change.
Yeah, what else can we do? I mean, we cannot go in front of an audience, so we connect with each other and we communicate and we try to share our views on the situation on theater. So there's also a good thing. There's a lot of networking. There's a lot of international communication on all levels. That's a good thing, but I think, again, it's linked to the fact that we cannot go in front of an audience at the moment.
Yeah, sure. And you did mention that the plague was an experience which was already, of course, happening during Shakespeare's time. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Andrew Webber, who's going to take us back to the classics and talk about how, adapting the classics and what you do to Shakespeare.
Yeah, indeed. And actually maybe starting with Ibsen and then moving on to Shakespeare, because there's maybe interesting comparisons. But yeah, so as I mentioned in the introduction, you're well known for landmark productions of Ibsen and Shakespeare. And I'd like to ask a question about one of each. And my first question relates to a production that I had the pleasure of seeing at the Schaubühne, that is Ibsen's Hedda Gabler, which you transferred to modern setting. But more than that setting in itself, I'd like to ask about the stagecraft that supported it, notably your trademark revolving stage and the use of glass walls and an overhead mirror. So perhaps could you tell us a bit about how those functioned in your reworking of the play, that is the stage in itself and through its apparatus?
Well, when we started to work on Hedda Gabler, me and my set designer Jan Pappelbaum, who is an architect actually, we were confronted with this line where he tells his auntie that this house was much too expensive. And later on in the play, Hedda says that she was dreaming of living in this house. So, but the house is much too expensive and he cannot afford it, which is part of the dramatic situation, the dramatic circumstances of the play. And so we were thinking about models or houses in the history of the 20th century of architecture. And we come about this Farnsworth house by Mies van der Rohe, and which is a famous story in the history of architecture, because this house was built for a lady who inherited a lot of money from her husband, and her dream was to live in a forest surrounded by the trees. So he built, Mies van der Rohe built a house out of glass walls. And famously, this woman later didn't feel at ease anymore in this house because she felt observed by the creatures of the forest around her. So she put curtains on the glass walls. But then Mies van der Rohe sued her because he thought this is an icon of architecture, and it was meant to be with glass walls, and he cannot put curtains. And I even do believe that he won the case. But anyway, what we were trying to do is to find a simple set, a very minimalistic set. So you only have this glass wall and a tiny little piece of concrete wall and a big sofa. And we wanted to create a feeling where this main character, Hedda Gabler, was living in a very fancy surrounding, beautiful surrounding, but at the same time, she felt she needed to feel exposed and in an atmosphere which is beautiful, but at the same time cannot be considered a home. So this was the idea, and this revolving stage in this case, and the mirror tried to emphasize this fact that from every angle you can look inside the house. Hedda Gabler is observed and followed from every viewpoint possible, even from above, because there's the mirror. So there's no place to hide. And even though it looks beautiful, she does not, or one does not feel at ease in this surrounding. So actually, a modern character who finds herself in a modern world, in a beautiful world, in a highly aesthetic, fancy world, but she doesn't find love in this.
As we've said before, love and death, yeah. And my second question, perhaps we could move on to Shakespeare and Richard III in particular, because of course you brought that production to London, to the Barbican, and it got a huge amount of attention, critical praise. And my question here is about language and about performance. You're on record as saying that this play is more about the politics of language than physical violence as such. And you might say that about Shakespeare generally. It would be an interesting thing to consider. But what do you think about the transposition of Shakespeare's language into the German prose of Marius von Meyenburg, who did the translation for that production? What did that achieve, that transposition? And in a play, and for a playwright so concerned with embodiment and the relationship between the body and language, I wonder whether you could say something specifically about that, about first the transposition of the language into contemporary German prose, I guess, broadly, and then how that relates to the embodied action of the drama in your working of it.
Well, it's not possible to translate all the beauty of Shakespeare's language, and it's not possible to communicate all the layers on which he is playing with the English language. I'm always giving this simple example of Hamlet, where Claudius says to Hamlet, "And what about you, my nephew and my son?" And the answer of Hamlet is, "I'm too much in the sun." So how would you possibly translate all these meanings of sun? I'm too much in the sun. I don't want to be your son. I'm too close to the sun, so to the king, which are only two levels of what he is communicating here. So one is always challenged with this problem when you put on Shakespeare in Germany. And another issue is, of course, the fact that the German language has much more syllables than English language. So when Shakespeare writes in the blank verse and puts a lot of meaning in a few syllables, and you try to translate this in a German blank verse, which is anyway odd in the German language, then you lose content because you have to put the same amount of syllables, but as usual, German words do have more amounts of syllables than English, you lose something. So that's the reason for why we mostly agree when we start to do an adaptation of a Shakespearean play, to not translate into verse, but to translate into prose, because the usual experience for me watching Shakespeare productions in Germany
think.
Yeah.
There's
You've
some
got
frozen.
a frozen moment here. Ah,
Okay, you're back.
yeah.
Okay. So my experience watching Shakespeare shows in German so far was always that I didn't understand 90% of what has been said on stage, because the very famous translations by Schlegel-Tieck, for example, these translations try to solve the issue with very strange form of putting the words in an order which sounds not right, but by this they try to respect the blank verse and the rhyme. Mm-hmm. So you have rhyme and verse, but you're listening to a language where you don't know what this should be. So as I do believe in the power of language and in the power of language on stage especially, and language as a tool for a fight with words, before it comes to a fight with weapons maybe, you should understand and what they are talking about, and of course you should give a language in the hands or in the mouth of the actors where they really can use it as a weapon. And so we decided to translate this not respecting the verse, and at the same time trying to give a glimpse of the poetry and the beauty of Shakespearean language. And if you look very precisely on the translations of Marius, he is still writing in a rhythmical language. So you have the beauty of a certain rhythm, but not the blank words.
Good. Well, thank you. Thanks very much. And well, the question about embodiment, maybe we can kind of bracket that off for a moment, because I think we should move on to perhaps talk about Professor Bernhardi, which was something that we promised we would do. And many people here will have had the opportunity, for which many thanks, to see a recording of that production. And I think Anya will take over again now and take us to Professor Bernhardi for a conversation about that other form of classic.
Okay, yes. So I guess we're skipping one scene and moving on to the final part of the conversation this evening. And before we will indeed open up the floor to questions. We really, I thought there are many reasons why your production of Professor Bernhardi by Arthur Schnitzer, which was premiered in December 2016, might resonate with discussions people would have had in this very moment. And yes, so some members of the audience might have been able to watch the recording of it, which the Schaubühne generously made available for today's occasion, and others might have seen it live or elsewhere.
Pfarrer, es wäre nicht richtig, ihr diesen letzten Traum zu nehmen.
Es ist vorbei. Gesundheit und Wissenschaft.
Du hast dich dem Pfarrer gegenüber unkorrekt benommen.
Herr Professor Bernhardi jüdischen Glaubens wurde von Pfarrer Reda dahingehend belehrt, dass er in Erfüllung seiner priesterlichen Pflicht erschienen sei.
Wir werden unserem Bernhardi heute unsere volle Solidarität aussprechen. Solidarität? Aha, wofür denn? Ich beantrage Suspendierung unseres Direktors von der Leitung des Elisabethinums bis zum Abschluss der gegen ihn eingeleiteten strafrechtlichen Ermittlungen. Bist du nachtragend, Bernhard?
Nein, ich habe nur ein gutes Gedächtnis. Wer nicht für mich ist, ist gegen mich. Guten Abend allerseits.
Okay, now, as I said, there are many reasons why I would like to put Professor Bernardi center stage today, and one of which is that there is a particular interest in Arthur Schnitzler's work in Cambridge, and Andrew Webber already talked about the digital edition project, and that a large part of Schnitzler's literary papers are held here at the University Library in Cambridge, and it's a kind of archive in exile. And there has been a lot of research activity around, and public interest and engagement around Arthur Schnitzler's works here in Britain. And moreover, Professor Bernardi is a medical trauma. It's a hospital trauma that peers into the workspace and the mind of doctors. And at a time when the hospital, and especially the ICU ward, the intensive care unit, has become a kind of mise en scene for a global health crisis. And so Schnitzler's play resonates with the current moment. And one aspect of Schnitzler's drama that I find intriguing is the absent role of his patients, their present absence, and that over the course of the entire play, they are not present on stage. And in your production, this device is circumvented by a live video broadcast of the ward where the woman is dying. And I don't know so much about Germany, but in Britain, there have been new technologies like iPads have been used quite extensively in hospitals in order to facilitate the communication with the outside world. And so this is just one resonance I'm picking up here, but I wondered, in the event that Schnitzler's hospital trauma were to be staged again, would you change anything to take account of the pandemic? And I'm aware that might be quite a fictive question, but yeah, and yeah, do you think you would change anything in the longer run?
Well, actually, I believe that the play is not so much about health care or medical issues, and that might be the reason for why there are no patients in the play. But this woman in the beginning dying, Schnitzler, in my opinion, wanted to write about the very nuanced ways and means to bring down a Jewish doctor in a hospital, the director of the hospital. So how can you put up a trap to destroy the career of this Jewish doctor, which was a social issue at the time, because at the end of the 19th century, there were quite a few Jewish hospitals, private hospitals, who made in science and in advancement of medical treatment a success story. And they were concurrents to the institutionalized hospitals of the Austrian or Vienna government. And they take him down by confronting him with this terrible anti-Semitic cliches, and this is what Schnitzler wanted to talk about, regardless the fact that he himself was a doctor. But what he tried to talk about is he wanted to portray a whole society. He wanted not only show the perpetrator and the victim, which would be Eberswald and Bernardi, but he also wanted to show the other people, where some of them were fighters against this reactionary forces. Others were behaving opportunistic. Others were radical young followers of this installed new opinion. And so you have the whole range of political performance in this range of characters. And so you need a place like a hospital, or I don't know, a Finanzamt, an authority for finance, or so you need a place where a lot of people are working together, where there is concurrence, careerism, and people trying to overtake others in the career. So you need all these interests. So then you can show how this poison of anti-Semitism or racism is ruining the social world and the behavior of a group of people, and how different people position themselves being confronted with racism. That's why, to my view, this play is put in a hospital, and that's why I do believe if I bring it back, there won't be any changes, because this is the issue of the play, and not it's not about medical questions. It's about humanism. It's about grace. It's about how this young woman gracefully can die, and it's about all the other political strategies the characters in the play are using, in my view.
So if you take, you say, the hospital as an image for the society, and more specifically, I mean, it is the Anglo-Hungarian Empire, which is dissected there, and its collapse, really, the system which is failing. And perhaps also bring it back to the question of the stage and the space, and how you have arranged it. And so I'm interested in the realism which you produced in the production. And yes, in some ways, this does bring us back to questions of two-dimensionality and three-dimensionality, and the zoom setting which we discussed earlier. And so the stage design, we saw that briefly in the short trailer, in the short clip we watched. If we look at the stage design of the production, it consists of a white cube, and in a way it can also present a blank page, which is then subsequently annotated with the names of the location of every act, and also with the props. And the words are wiped away or crossed out again with every change of location and change of act, even though they may remain mainly visible. And this happens, interestingly, in juxtaposition to the real furniture and the real people that co-create the theatrical space. And in a way, it provides us with the idea of how the different spaces are connected and intersect. And despite of the three-dimensionality of the theater and the modernity of Schnitzler's play, you chose this localization technique in 2 dimensions. And then this practice, again, we have another kind of remediation, is filmed live, a quite traditional method by now, and projected and overlaid on top of the writing, which turns the page into a screen in a way. So in a time when we are frequently forced to interact and live through screens, this localization technique takes on an additional meaning, I would argue, today. And what these projected images do on the theatrical stage is that they cast into question what is real and what is an illusion. So now that we actually have learned that cyberspace, a virtual space, there's some reality to it. It's not like completely removed from our world. I did wonder whether this kind of contrasting, if you want, does theater or does theater maker need to come up with new ways of locating us in space? Particularly now that many of us have experienced that virtual space is real to some extent.
Well, honestly, I did not think about all this when I did make this production. My aim was to, again, like I said, for Hedda Gabler, I think the main path of my work until 1 or 2 years ago was to reduce, to minimalize, to create an effect with less means possible, and to focus on the actors. So, and especially in this play, as I already described, I wanted really to make very visible the different ways of the characters positioning themselves in this game of power. And I wanted the audience to see this play like under a lens, in like a microscope in a medical laboratory.
Yeah. We have this zooming in factor. That's nice.
Yeah. But I didn't want the audience to be distracted with anything aesthetically around. Of course, I tried to install an advanced aesthetic, minimalist but still tasteful aesthetic. But with less means possible, so you can concentrate on the story, and you can follow the story, which is quite complex and quite nuanced, and where there's a lot of characters involved, and this play usually is not put on stage because a lot of people are afraid of this play because it's so big, it's so long, it's so complex. And I wanted out of this play, because I think that what it's talking about is so important. Sadly enough, I wanted to have an edited version of the play, which is fast in the pace, but still people can follow and are not bored. And for this, I made the transitions between the different spaces of the play, was just writing on the wall where we are now, and that's the change, with some furniture, and that's it, not more, and no big scene changes involving a lot of technicians and eating the time of the performance.
Yeah, Thomas, thanks so much for your responses. I'm watching. We said at this point we would go for a more open Q&A. I'm watching the chat, and we don't have a question. We've got a very nice comment so far, but no questions. While people please do put forward, you just say question or mention a single word theme, and we'll come to you. Perhaps I could, meantime, just come back on what you said to Anja's question about the medical drama. And while understanding what you mean, that this could be about any social institution on one level, it is nonetheless about a social institution which is very concerned with embodiment. So I'd like to come back to the question of the body. Mm-hmm. And one thing that was very interesting, it may be that you wouldn't stage the play differently now, but how would an audience see the play would be a different kind of question, assuming it's staged in the same way. Or how do we see that now? That clip had had a nice little bit of hand sanitizer, for instance, which has become one of the most routine gestures of everyday life. But more particularly, questions of, in this play, very formal, very restrained bodily touch between people, forms of intimacy which are not very intimate. One thing that was very interesting about your version of Bernhardi is that you took out the handshake between the priest and Bernhardi, which is often seen as being a very particular kind of focal moment of the drama, this moment of relative intimacy between these two antagonist figures. But I think things like handshakes, which we don't do anymore, do you see what I mean? That there is a kind of corporeality, which isn't the care of the patient. It's rather how people react between each other, not just with words, but also with body language.
Yeah, definitely. I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, I am rehearsing at the moment different shows. I was about to premiere a version of Bernard's text by Virginie Despentes, and we've been rehearsing. Our actors and me, we are tested twice a week so that we can rehearse under sanitary measurements. And honestly, it took us only 1 or 2 hours to get used to the fact that you cannot get too close anymore. And we're not making an issue out of it anymore. I mean, they are behaving like we are behaving now. We're trying to keep the distance, and it's quite it's going quite well, actually. Of course, an audience watching the show will have a different experience by watching an old show like Bernardi or a new one. But this has become part of our social behavior. But you're right, I am completely obsessed with body language and social behavior in certain rooms, and what can be told with the behavior of a person towards another one. How many things you can already tell by the way they move, by the way they get close or not. But that would be a big seminar.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Well, questions are rolling in now, so I'll perhaps take them in the order in which they have appeared here. So from Ataman, I only have the handle, Ataman. I have a question. Could you unmute and ask your question?
Okay, thank you for your talk, Thomas. Very interesting. My question is, what would be right now really urgent to say in theater for you? Like, where are you working at? In what are you working right now? And what would be, the next question is, what would be really important, necessary to say to the world? I mean, to the people all over wherever theater is being showed.
Well, my theater is always about the contradiction, and it's never about a clear message that needs to be said. I always like this definition of tragedy, which is that there is one character which is right, and people can 100% understand the argument and the point, and there's another character who's also completely right, and we can share the point. And that creates tragic, and this tension is tragic because they're both right, but not both of them can act out the fact that they are right. One maybe even has to die because of the other one. So this tragic feeling towards the world is what I'm most of the time talking about. And I think this is the big difference between literature, novels, theater plays, any form of narration, that it reflects the complexity of our life and the problem we have as human beings, that a lot of times we know what is right or what we should do, but we do the opposite. So we are trapped in this contradiction, to know the truth, to know what is better, and to not do it. I mean, there are so many issues. I'm just mentioning the climate crisis. We all know that what we are doing is not right, but we still keep on doing it. Of course, there are interests of economy, there are interests of big companies who want to sell their cars, who cannot stop their production from one day to another. Okay, we can break it down, but this tragische Weltgefühl, this is what I'm always concerned with. And the book I brought to the stage, Vernon Subutex by Virginie Despentes, is an incredible portrait of Parisian society. Could be compared to Zola or other French writers of the realistic period, end of 19th century. So it's again a panorama of all the different social realities, and again something where you cannot decide what to do in the end, and you're left alone with this feeling, and you have to make up your mind yourself. So I always loved the sentence of a famous American filmmaker who said, if you have a message, write a letter. Making movies or making theater is not about having a message. It's about
what production are you right now? Are you working in?
I just finished the work on Vernon Subutex.
On
Vernon Subutex by Virginie Despentes, which is a novel, a trilogy, and I envy you that you don't know it, because it means that you can still read it. I already have it behind me. Virginie Despentes, French woman, beautiful writer.
I'm conscious, Thomas, we've got a number of questions. It would be great if we could move on perhaps to Katie Unwin.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to ask, we've obviously touched upon how the pandemic has led us to lead a kind of two-dimensional reality. But when we do step outside into these spaces that you were talking about, of cultural and social encounter, for example, the town square or the supermarket, the places that we kind of have to inhabit once in a while, to what extent can we talk about theatrical qualities or performativity of the pandemic at the moment? Because to me, it seems, I've just been making a few notes, kind of obvious that there are expected uniforms or costumes that we have to wear now, you know, the face mask, bringing the hand sanitizer with us. And there's also quite clear stage direction in our lives now in terms of like floor markings and following certain paths as we walk through and navigate these spaces. So I was just wondering how you would interpret that thought, and sort of how the Schaubühne has moved into our everyday lives during the pandemic.
Wow. I never thought about it, to be honest. I never thought about the performativity under COVID and how we are forced to invent a new way of social behavior. I never thought about it.
I'm really glad this comes up, because this was a scene which was omitted, and the theatricalization of everyday life, and how.
I'm not sure if it's a theatricalization of everyday life, only because we are wearing masks. I mean, everybody is so cautious. We don't even speak up loud anymore, because we know if we talk loud, there's more threat. So we are very cautious, and this takes a lot of theatricality when you all the time behave and act in a down-leveled way. I would say, and I hope that the time after the post-pandemic life will be a life full of theatricality.
But is it perhaps a different kind of theatricality, a kind of muted theatricality?
Definitely, it's muted, but I'm not sure it's theatrical. If it was, it would be very bad theater. Very boring.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah. Perhaps I could move us on. I know, Thomas, you were particularly keen to take questions, I think, from students.
Yeah.
There is such a question I see here, which is from Siamala Roberts. I'll read it perhaps rather than put it. Or Siamala, do you want to say it yourself?
Yeah, sure, I can. Yeah, I just got a question, which is how does recording or filming the stage productions change the actors' performances or your experience of directing their performances? And I ask this question as a singer who is currently allowed to record singing, but not perform it in the way that we would usually do so with audience and so on. Yeah.
So you are a singer?
Yes, sort of, yes.
Well, all the recordings you've been seeing during the seminar so far were recordings which we made before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And usually I try. I'm always working with my actors on a certain truthfulness. So when the camera gets close, it gets even more difficult to be truthful in the very moment, and it's very challenging to. But this is anyway what my theater is about. It's very challenging to kind of project your voice in a bigger auditorium, but at the same time not become theatrical in a negative way, where you all of a sudden understand, oh, this is banal tone and sound of theater, or actors speak very explicit, and so I'm always trying to avoid this, and recording my shows is sometimes quite frustrating, because I can see that they are faking all the time.
Mm-hmm. Ah, interesting. So you would say more truthfulness in live performance, do you think?
No, I think no. When it comes to nuanced emotions, like little thoughts or suspicious regards, this is much more challenging in front of a camera.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. So our next question, I think, is from Peter Barnes. I'll just say this, perhaps. How much respect should a director have for the intentions of the playwright? I guess this is a Regie Theater kind of question, really, but...
Yeah, well, from... Where does it come from? Who's talking here? I cannot see him. Well, this would mean that the writer, him or herself, would completely understand why he or she wrote the play. And as far as I learned from my 25 years of experience working together with writers, a lot of writers don't know themselves what beauty they are able to put on when they are writing. So there should always be an ambivalence. Nevertheless, I'm considered in Germany to be a director who very much respects the will or the idea of a writer. But when it comes, for example, to the great plays of Shakespeare, in each and every play, there are 5 or 6 possible plays which you can put on stage. So when it comes to this genius-like writing, you have to make up your mind about what you want to talk about. You have to take a decision. Which story of the 5 stories which are in one play you want to focus on.
Thank you. A question from Daniela S. Is Daniela there?
Just try to, can you hear me? Is this
Yeah.
one? Thank you, Thomas, for coming to talk to us this evening. My question is potentially a little bit self-gratifying as I'm writing my thesis on Rainer Werner Fassbinder, but hopefully it'll have some broader interest for everybody. Do you think that there is a sort of, seeing as Fassbinder initially started out in the German counterculture, so the action theatre and then the anti-theater, do you think that there is a certain theatricality about his staging of bodies and things and dialogue in his films that sort of bled over from his work for stage into the screen? And did that give you a bit of a foothold for adapting Maria Braun?
As far, sorry, you finished? I
Yes.
didn't want to interrupt you. As far as I know, the anti-theater of Rainer Werner Fassbinder, or the action theater, was highly formalistic. So in a way, it wasn't theatrical in the sense that people are doing big gestures and big emotions, but it was very reduced. People were not allowed to move. They had to stand still and perform in a very formalistic way. So I think you can still see this in a lot of his movies. He wanted, in the performance of the actors, he wanted to have kind of an anti-naturalistic style. He wanted to have this artificial touch to the acting. But a lot of what we see in his movies actually happened by accident. For example, his very famous movie Katzelmacher, where you can see the characters sitting outside in the square of these apartment houses.
The static was just an accident because they couldn't move it because it was so gigantic.
The camera was so gigantic that they couldn't move it upstairs, so they stayed outside in the square, and this is how the blocking of the actors happened. So
was that what drew you to adapt a film for the stage, though? Because Fassbinder obviously did write some plays. I'm just wondering why you went for Maria Braun.
That's a very personal story, which is linked to a very sad love story which I had, and this woman asked me to put the play on stage, and because I loved her, I put the play on stage. Has got nothing to do with Fassbinder or anything else. It's just because it's about these two characters who were in love and never could come together, and that's why she asked me to put the play on stage.
That's a better answer than I could have hoped for. Thank you.
Thanks. I think we've got time for maybe we can stretch the envelope just by a few minutes, but just a couple more questions perhaps. So John Guthrie asks, why don't you like Goethe and Schiller? They are not just imitators of Shakespeare in my view, but great dramatists in their own right. So can you say any more about
They probably are. This was pure provocation. I mean, Schiller put it himself, and the whole German classic is about ideas. You know, these characters are exchanging ideas, and so I have a lack of flesh and blood always. They are only carrying ideas around. And, I miss what I've been describing before, which is a contradiction in the characters. And even though Shakespeare is talking about ideas in each of his plays, there is much more layers, and there's always behind all this is always the big question of why we are here, what are we doing here, and why we are capable to do the most terrible and monstrous things, and each and everybody amongst us is capable of doing this, and this is more how I perceive the world.
Thank you. So perhaps I could just join a couple of questions together, which are both about taking up this question about, I guess, theatre in the digital age and questions of dimensionality, what theatre might be able to do, as Ariel puts it, to reintegrate people's ideas and concepts in a more thoughtful way than the world of Twitter seems to enable. Can you say any more about that, Thomas? You touched on it already in what you said earlier, but...
Well, most of the theater doesn't. First of all, I mean, most of the theater I'm watching is very boring and old-fashioned, and I don't understand why the actors are on stage, and I cannot stand their how vain they are on stage, and so it's a bit hard for me to promote theater here, because most of the theater I see, I hate. I find it terrible, disgusting. So I'm not a big promoter of theater. I like to go into a rehearsal room and share time with actors, and sometimes it's even worth sharing this time, because you really understand something about yourselves, and the actors make experiences which confront them with their lives. And so for me, it's more laboratory about la condition humaine. And and Twitter is just a tool to exchange and to consider yourself being important because you have 500 followers following what you're thinking about the world. So
okay, yeah, thank you. I think Thomas, you've done an awful lot for us. I think one more question perhaps, and this is only fair because James Woodall, as you say, is present, and because we saw an article by him earlier, he has a question for you, which is, he says, goes off piste. James, would you like to put that question yourself?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Thomas.
Hi.
I wish I was with you in Berlin, but I'll just have to shelve that for the time being. Very good to see you again. Could you tell us a little bit about the film you're in, Schwesterlein? And I asked that actually in the theatrical context, because of course the Schaubühne is a bit of a star in the film, as indeed momentarily are you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. This movie is a movie which was shot by two up-and-coming filmmakers from Switzerland, from the French part of Switzerland.
Véronique Raymond and Stephanie Chouard.
Yeah. And I know these two incredibly beautiful artists for 25 years or more. When they were still actresses, we've been working together in Geneva in 1992. And that's how we met, and they were following my work, and then all of a sudden they became filmmakers, and they became successful filmmakers, and then they were still watching my work, and my work was kind of an inspiration for them, and pretty much important because they started out as theater actresses, and so they were dreaming of making a movie which involves the Schaubühne and the universe of our theater, and two of our main actors, Nina Hoss and Lars Eidinger. And as it is also playing a little bit with the reality of Lars and Nina in the movie. Lars is an actor at Schaubühne in the movie playing Hamlet, but he has been diagnosed cancer, so he cannot continue to perform. And that's what the movie is about. And they are both brother and sister, and it's about her encouraging him to go through this crisis, and then putting herself into question the life she's leading in Switzerland with a successful businessman. And they needed an artistic director because I'm the one who's constantly telling Lars that he cannot go on stage, that I have to replace him, that there will be another actor performing Hamlet now. And also they put up a kind of love story between me and Nina. So that's a movie. It's worth watching.
That's a very a nice final question, nice final response, and a nice final recommendation. I think we should draw to a close now. We could go on and on because the questions stream on, but I'd like to give some thanks. I'd like to thank in the first instance Anya for making this event happen. I'd like to thank our administrator Mel and our volunteers who've made this show work so smoothly, and all of you, our audience participants. But above all, of course, our warm thanks goes to Thomas Ostermeier. You've been tremendously generous and thoughtful in your responses to all of those questions, and we're very grateful for that at a time when we know you have many other things to do.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Great. Zoom doesn't do applause very well as a collective act of thanks, but I think we can nonetheless all do it in our little separate boxes. Thanks very much, Thomas.
And hopefully we can have the theatre of a Cambridge dinner at some point.
Indeed.
I would love to. I mean, this is really, I don't mind talking to you on screen, but I do mind that we didn't have the dinner.
Yes.
We'll do that. We'll definitely do that.
I did put the candle up in my background, and I also have a 3D printer. And
wow. This is very promising.
Okay. Thanks again to you and to everybody.
Thank you for everybody.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.